Good afternoon, everyone here in Denmark and Europe, and good morning and good evening to those of you joining us from the Americas and from Asia. My name is Luke Patey, and welcome to this webinar at the Danish Institute for International Studies on US-China tech competition and the impact on Europe and democracy. We're very excited to host this webinar today as we have two excellent speakers on China, tech, and geopolitics, whom I'll introduce momentarily. We've also been looking forward to this event because it marks an initial public event for a new 3-year research program at DIIS on technology and international politics. So please stay tuned for more activities and research and policy work on tech at DIIS in the coming weeks, months, and years ahead. Finally, we're happy to be partnering on this event with the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which will soon hold its Technology for Democracy dialogue in the coming week or two. Today, our focus will be squarely on technology and geopolitics. The development and use of new and emerging technologies, such as artificial intelligence and 5th generation mobile networks, are already making substantial changes to our daily life, to our politics and economics around the world. These changes from technology are mixing quite turbulently with discord and tension in relations with the world's two superpowers, the United States and China. China has demonstrated a fast-growing ability to innovate and adopt new technologies into its politics, economy, and society in the last decade or so. It is now ranked at number 12 in the Global Innovation Index, which is an unprecedented position for a middle-income country. Because of its sheer size, of both its economy and its population, and its difference in political values, China has come to offer a challenge to the tech supremacy of both the United States and the West. Today, we'll hear from two speakers to better understand this rivalry and its impact on us here in Europe. Our first speaker will be Nigel Inkster, CMG. Nigel is a senior advisor for cyber security and China at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. His expertise spans transnational terrorism and organized crime to cybersecurity and intelligence and security. Nigel also has an over 30-year-long career in the British Secret Intelligence Service. His recent book, The Great Decoupling, China, America, and the Struggle for Technology Supremacy, was published by Hurst late last year. It offers fantastic insights into China's rise as a tech power, how its growing tech capabilities are interlinked with its broader geopolitical ambitions and national identity, and the ongoing contest between the US and China to dominate new and emerging technologies. After Nigel speaks, we'll hear from Didi Kirsten Tatlow, a senior fellow at the Asia program at the German Council on Foreign Relations in Berlin, and a senior non-resident fellow at Project Synopsis in Prague. Her research focuses on, among other subjects, China's political system and China's impact on Europe through its technology and ideological endeavors. Didi enters research after an over 20-year-long career as a journalist for both the South China Morning Post in Hong Kong and the New York Times. And in research and reporting, she's responsible for some path-breaking work on China's relations and influence in Germany and other democracies. Didi is co-editor and co-author of China's Quest for Foreign Technology Beyond Espionage, which was published by Routledge earlier this year. The book offers really a penetrating examination of how China has employed legal, illegal, and plenty of gray space in between to ascertain foreign technologies and know-how that alongside its indigenous efforts have transformed China into a tech leader. So I invite you all to get a copy of both Nigel and Didi's books, which make for an excellent pairing for understanding China's rise as a tech power and its influence in the world. So how we'll run the program today is both Nigel and Didi will have around 15 minutes to speak, and then together we'll have around a half an hour for Q&A. So for the audience, please pose a question at any point during the conversation and these presentations in the box in your Zoom panel. I'll address these individually or I'll group them together depending on how many we get. So without further word from me, I'll pass it over to Nigel for his talk.
Luke, thank you very much for that kind introduction and for promoting my book. I think you may have just doubled my sales. It's also a great pleasure to be working with the Danish Institute for International Studies. I've had dealings with Denmark in various capacities during my career, and I've always unfailingly been impressed by their focus and professionalism. So it's a great pleasure to be talking here today. And the fact is that when we look at China, the transformation technologically that we've witnessed over the last few decades has been nothing short of remarkable. I mean, the first time I went to China in 1976, in the drive-in from Beijing airport, the driver had to drive on side lights because the headlights would have otherwise risked frightening the pack horses that were critical to the supply of China's capital in the mid-1970s. From there to the China we see today has been a remarkable journey. And of course, modern technologies, excuse me, have been at the heart of this. And when China embarked on its modernization program, already they were well aware of how advanced technology, in particular information communication technologies, were going to be critical to achieving their objectives of becoming a modern, developed economy. And at the outset, this was a gamble. China recognized that in adopting these technologies, it was assuming considerable risks, both because it was totally reliant upon US technology to get started, and also because they were well aware that baked into that technology, those technologies, was a set of values very much not compatible with those of the Chinese Communist Party. So, you know, this was a big risk that they took. And of course, it remains the case even today that China is uncomfortably dependent on US technologies in order to achieve its objectives. And I'll go into a bit more detail in a moment about what those dependencies and vulnerabilities are. But whilst people like Bill Clinton were saying that trying to control the internet was like nailing Jello to a wall, the Chinese Communist Party were busy practicing nailing Jello to the wall. And they've demonstrated a remarkable facility for doing that by imposing their own values through a pervasive network of censorship and controls, by excluding US service providers from the telecommunications industry, and thereby enabling Chinese companies like Huawei, ZTE to emerge as national champions. They have been able to, so to speak, mitigate the worst, as they would see it, impacts of reliance on US technology. And from there, they have they've moved with remarkable speed to create a more or less separate sinosphere, if you will, in the technology space. Anyone who goes on the Chinese internet will see that it's once very familiar, but at the same time very different from browsing experiences in the Western world. So where do we find ourselves now in relation to US-China technology competition and cooperation? Because in fact, we're looking at the two things happening simultaneously. Since 2018, when the Trump administration initiated first a trade and then a technology war with China, in which inter alia it sought to deny China access to some of the most advanced technology inputs on which it was still dependent. We've seen a situation in which the US government is pulling in one direction and the majority of Silicon Valley is pulling in the other direction, because many companies in Silicon Valley, and the Chinese talk about what they call the Bada Jingang, the 8 guardian warriors, which is the sort of 8 biggest US corporations: Qualcomm, Intel, Cisco, Apple, et cetera. And these companies have very strong vested interests in technology collaboration with China, because of course sales to China represent a very substantial percentage of their revenues. And absent those revenues, the implications for the ability of these companies to invest in R&D and further innovation is obviously diminished. That is a problem. We have seen some in Silicon Valley, notably Eric Schmidt, kind of looking, as it were, beyond the quarterly returns and saying that the sort of objective circumstances and geopolitical realities dictate that some degree of technology decoupling may not just be desirable, but is probably inevitable. And the United States should focus on working out what this decoupling might look like. But we are in this kind of sort of messy intermediate situation where we have competition and we have cooperation happening simultaneously. China's objectives in all of this are quite clear and have been enunciated by the top leadership. China essentially aspires to be a global leader in all advanced technologies by the year 2035. That is quite clear. And they are devoting enormous resources both to indigenous innovation in areas like advanced microprocessors, artificial intelligence, quantum, and at the same time acquiring elsewhere or from around the world what they don't think they can produce indigenously. And well, how's that all going? I'm constantly being asked, as between China and the United States, who is sort of up, who's down, who's where in this technology contest. And the short answer is that it's a bit like being asked to describe the length of a piece of string, because the technologies themselves evolve in unpredictable ways, simply sort of reliable information can also be very difficult to come by, particularly in China, which is characterized by high levels of opacity. But if we look very briefly at the key areas, arguably still for China, the biggest problem is advanced microprocessors. And I know microprocessors sound so 20th century, and we're already in 2021, but microprocessors are, in fact, the sort of critical building block for much else that China is seeking to do. And the simple fact is that China remains several generations behind the United States and its allies in the design and ability to manufacture the most advanced microprocessors. We're talking here about the 5 and 3 nanometer process nodes using advanced ultraviolet lithography, process which has been likened to designing, building a 60-story building 1 story at a time, only the building is the thickness, 1,000th of the thickness of a human hair. And at some point, and this is of course where the United States is able to exercise considerable control, because although the United States itself has largely gone fabless, so to speak, in other words, they design these microprocessors, but don't themselves make them. They've contracted that out to locations like Taiwan and South Korea. Most of the intellectual property that goes into the manufacture of these microprocessors is American, and therefore enables the US government to determine who gets it. And through this, we have seen, in effect, China's 5G national champion, Huawei, being kneecapped by US imposition of controls on export of advanced microprocessors. A lot of, China's investing huge sums of money in trying to catch up, but it's not immediately clear to me that this is necessarily going to work. It's less clear how much effort China is putting into developing alternatives to silicon-based microprocessors. All this is subject to Moore's law, which describes an exponential process. It will end. There will come a point at which we simply can't cram more circuitry onto a minute bit of silicon. We're going to have to look at other materials. China clearly is doing that, but I suspect they're spending a lot more time and effort, so to speak, reinventing the wheel. When it comes to other areas, 5G we've talked about, and there China was able to steal a march, not because it was superior in terms of technical innovation, but because they focused on end-to-end production of 5G networks in a way that the West was unable to replicate. And even Western companies like Nokia and Ericsson are critically reliant on Chinese inputs to their own 5G networks. But that is an area where clearly China moved ahead. Artificial intelligence, well, yes, again, China has huge ambitions, massive ambitions, and some very clear strengths, notably data, including, it must be said, all the data that they've stolen from, bulk data that they've stolen from the United States and other Western companies. We don't know exactly what they're doing with that data, but clearly they've taken the view that the more the complex data sets they can acquire, the better. And there are some areas, AI, well, it covers a multitude of sins, and it's very difficult to generalize about something as broad as this. But I think where China has the advantages in data and the ability for its companies to access data, but I think it still does have problems with the basic mathematics of algorithms. These things do not work in a predictable way. We don't even understand how they work fully in many cases. And applying these algorithms to different applications does require a degree of what the Germans call Fingerspitzgefühl, which is something they're sort of layers of innate knowledge that you only do, acquire through long practice. This is an area of vulnerability, but at the same time, we're seeing that the Chinese Communist Party is mandating that henceforth Chinese algorithms must incorporate Chinese Communist Party values. There is no such thing as a values-free algorithm. They all reflect the innate biases and assumptions of the people who are designing them. It's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out. There are other areas, quantum computing and quantum encryption, where it's quite clear that China is investing huge resources and way ahead, particularly in quantum communication. At the same time, and there has just been a RAND study published on this issue, it still looks as if the three areas in which quantum has applications, which are sensors, communications, and computing, are at the very least a decade and probably more from being capable of turning into something that can be applied at any kind of scale in the real world. At the moment, it's still an experiment in particle physics more than anything else. But China is really working very hard at this. And the latest experiments conducted by Professor Pan Jianwei in Hefei, where I think they produced 113 photons in a computer using Gaussian boson detection, does seem to be genuinely way ahead of anything anyone else has got. But it's very difficult to make comparisons because we're dealing with two very different approaches. China top-down, the United States reliant very heavily on the private sector for investment. And we're seeing, and I'll end with this because I want to give Didi a chance to say what she has to say. We're dealing with two very different approaches, not just in terms of top-down versus bottom-up, so to speak, but also in the way that China is now seeking to exercise greater control over its own technology companies, the big companies, the Alibabas, the Tencents, et cetera, in ways that are very difficult to predict the outcome. The aim is to constrain the powers of companies who've got too big, run by people nominally Communist Party members, but who everybody knows don't really share Communist Party values, but also to try to create space for greater innovation by Chinese small and medium-sized enterprises. Will this work? We don't know. If you look across the world at the United States, we've seen the United States Congress locked in battle with major technology corporations like Facebook, Google, etc., seeking to impose some kind of antitrust legislation and controls, which the companies rather disingenuously say they want, but rather in an Augustinian fashion, regulation lord, but not yet, and only if it perpetuates our existing business model. It hasn't happened yet, whether it will, and what the implications would be for small and medium enterprises in the United States remains to be seen. But for the United States, one of the big, well, for everybody, one of the big challenges, and particularly in some of these more unproven technologies, is how do you keep companies afloat until they are in a position to commercialize the research that they've been conducting. In the Chinese case, it's easy, it's through government subsidies. In the United States, they haven't really quite sort of worked out where they're going with this yet. So it's a very messy situation, very uncertain of outcome, but it's quite clear that, as you said at the beginning, China is very rapidly closing the gap with the United States, and in certain areas may well be poised to overtake it.
Thanks very much, Nigel. Thanks for that overview and on different approaches, but also the interconnections that are very much still there and the dependencies between China and the US. So I'll pass on the floor to Didi now. Please go ahead when you're ready.
Yeah, hi, thank you very much. And thanks for that, Luke. Also, thanks for that really very generous introduction. And Nigel, too, that's very interesting first part. Nigel, you mentioned quite rightly the extraordinary changes in recent decades in China, 4 and 5 decades, not wanting to turn on the lights on the old airport highway for fear of frightening the donkeys and the horses. I just about remember that too. I think that, to step back a little bit from this situation, I think that what we're really dealing with here, and one of the main interests in this issue, China technology, power as a politics, is really the massive knowledge challenge that we have here in the so-called West, including industrialized nations everywhere, including nations everywhere that isn't China, basically, if you like, to understand what's going on there in this area and what has been going on for decades now, because we simply didn't see it. And, we didn't pay attention, we didn't see it, we didn't take it seriously because, power imbalances. We're in the West, we have these sort of post-colonial cultures that gave a certain point of view. We didn't think we needed to take it seriously. We clearly do. And I think this challenges us greatly. It relates to our own national and domestic knowledge structures and all kinds of issues. So, I think that what we try to do in our book, China's Quest for Foreign Technology Beyond Espionage, was to sort of pull aside the curtain in front of that lack of knowledge, which is simply information. We haven't had the information about what China was doing in terms of building its science and technology plans. And of course, I probably don't need to remind this audience, but science and technology isn't just science and technology. Of course, it's also state building. It's all kinds of power and control expressions too. That's the case in our own societies, as well as material living. It's very important, material level. So my overriding sense is that we really know very, very little. And I think that I will just briefly quote from the preface of our book to give a flavor to those who perhaps haven't read it. This book is about China's rise as a neo-totalitarian technological power. Now we say neo-totalitarian because of the technology, the possibilities it gives for controlling human beings, which was made possible through access to science and technology created by countries it now challenges for global leadership. So that's a very kind of, if you like, a holistic sentence, I think, that shows, it lays out the problem, and it also shows what is the problem in this problem, if you like, the point being a political one. It is challenging for global leadership, political systems, countries that have political systems that are very different from China's. Why is this a problem for us? And so basically in the book, our aim is to describe this astonishing yet poorly understood phenomenon in a manner for policymakers and the general public, very important, not just up to policymakers so they can do things, but sideways, if you like, to the general public, so that we have these well-informed publics in democracies, which we need in democracies for them to function properly, and to propose solutions to protect the open societies of the liberal world order. So that is kind of what we set out to do. And I think that what is very clear from our book is, we've really kind of minutely laid out that the systems, a very large, very detailed, very deliberate system of building up a science and technology capacity for spotting overseas technology, for bringing it back, how to bring it back through myriad methods, if you like. The actual phrase is through multiple methods, created in 2001 by 5 Chinese ministries. They just put it out there and said, Chinese scholars, students, go out there and get science and technology from the developed industrialized nations through multiple methods. For those who speak Chinese, 以多种方式 might be nice to know. And bring it back to China, commercialize it. There's an enormous network of technology transfer centers, overseas returnee parks in China, very intricate, very application and production focused. And this entire effort has fed into this extraordinary economic rise that we have seen in China, indeed, since the late 1970s. And in addition, of course, to the undeniable, incredible hard work of a whole lot of people and a lot of intelligence and ambition. But the technology transfer part simply cannot be overlooked when you, whether it's legal technology transfers, of which in our book we identified 32 methods of technology transfer going on from developed industrialized nations to China. 12 of them are legal, would include things like PRC-backed, state-backed venture capital funds investing in Silicon Valley, investing in everywhere really. Investments, acquisitions of companies, obviously, direct technology purchases, joint research agreements, collaboration agreements. 8 of them are illegal. This includes obviously espionage, things like willful patent infringement, computer network exploitation, traditional espionage, breach of contract, copyright infringement, and 12 more of them, if I add them up, does that add up to 32? I think so. Extra legal transfers, gray zone. And a lot of this is about things that why are they gray zone? That for 2 reasons. First of all, because our own legal systems often can't deal with the type of activities that the Communist Party in China and this enormous sort of educational research, also espionage, and also United Front system that it controls, and all the stuff that goes with that, all the arms of government and of the party that feed into that, that it just can't really define a lot of this activity because it's completely sort of unique. China's come up with really unique methods of doing things, as well as methods that are very familiar to us, perhaps from, for example, from the Soviet Union or from Russia today, or even from some of our own methods, if you like. But the other reason is simply that a lot of this activity is taking place in China, in places that we have no insight into. We can't go into places because it's not an open society. We all know that. It's been growing increasingly closed. I first went to China myself in 1984 when I was still at school in Hong Kong. I first lived there as a student, 1985 to 86. Returned again from 1990 to 2092, excuse me, and again from 2003 to 2017. And in some really key ways, at the same time as it's becoming more open or globally connected, if you like, over that sweep of time, it's also become more granularly shut in some ways. It's much harder in some ways to find out what's going on now in China. You used to be able to sort of find out things that were happening at quite a high level in politics around 2 corners because you knew someone or knew someone else who knew someone. That's really difficult now. And I think one of the reasons is that there's so much money in the system in China, that people have a lot to lose by talking, and discipline has grown, party discipline has grown. But that's a whole nother issue. I won't get into that. But there we have these sort of extra legal transfer venues that where we really have no insight into. And this points, of course, to the fundamental discrepancy, lack of reciprocity between China and us, which is that our researchers. There is a body of Western research, so-called Western researchers now working in China. It's a complicated story. They certainly don't have the access and the freedom and they have a very different experience there, I think, than the other way around. And that's been the case for a long time. I'm not saying that they don't get to do things, but it's a very different system. And people who are coming back from China, so-called Western researchers, often have rather sort of interesting and sometimes quite disturbing tales to tell about how things were and what they experienced there as they sort of get drawn into the CCP system, research and educational system. So, then to get onto the issue of just how different this is. For example, we have in China approximately 100,000 science and technology employees, sort of system employees, who are basically tasked with identifying and managing a system of what China needs in terms of science and technology from overseas and how to get hold of it. And then you have this, and that's not even counting the actual researchers, and the students and the scholars. And then you have enormous library systems, and I use the word library broadly, Obviously, it's not all books and libraries, it's all kinds of online information management, engineering, and you've got parallel systems. You've got one happening in the sort of university and government sphere, you've got one happening in the military sphere. And, you know, at the end of the day, well, you have more than a whole incredibly detailed book in it, you know, in this system, which is what we came up with. It really packed with detail, makes it quite demanding reading, if I may say so, about you know, something that was partly my own product. But, you know, a lot of really, really granular information in there, I think. But, you know, we also need to fundamentally address the issue of how we're going to manage this, given the vast political differences in our systems. You know, to slightly illustrate this, I think it's important to know that back in 1956 is when China actually began its first long-term science development plan, and that was demanded by Zhou Enlai, the then premier, and of course spy master of China, which is a fact which is far less known than the fact that he was premier, which is very well known. But he also tended the United Front system. That was his sort of lifelong thing. You know, Zhou Enlai told people to go away and construct a science and technology system for China, because they saw very clearly that China had in fact fallen horribly behind outside countries in the whole colonial phase. You know, it had turned inwards, we know that, and it had this deep cultural anxiety, rightly so. And so how were the communists going to sort of deal with that? Well, Zhou Enlai told people to go away and to construct a, you know, essentially a sort of a information-based, almost espionage-based science and technology gathering system. And in fact, there's a quote in a paper, which I can reference if people would like, where the initial attempt was that people went away and presented a plan for this in 1956. And he sort of told them, they came back and he told them off and said, you know, this plan isn't really very good. If you want to catch up scientifically and technologically with the West, you know, overtake the United States in 50 to 60 years, Great Britain in 15 years, as Mao said in 56 as well, you know, you need a plan, and you need an intelligence agency, essentially a science and technology intelligence agency. And really, I think that one can trace what's happened in China very much along those lines. It's very much been very aware of the intelligence nature of this kind of the value of this science and technological information. It has not been an open enterprise, sort of post-enlightenment, if you like, information gathering for the good of the world. It's been very focused. And that's just profoundly different. And so, you know, how are we going to merge all this? Well, I think that's maybe a topic for discussion. I'll end very shortly. I hope I haven't gone on too long, Luke. But just to point perhaps to, I'm in Berlin in Germany, and, you know, Angela Merkel was chancellor for 16 years. She's in the process of retiring. She's been quite criticized for being very sort of soft on China, would be the phrase, you know. But in fact, at a recent event in Tel Aviv, at the international, the Israel National, what's it called? The International National Security Studies, the INSS in Tel Aviv. She spoke very frankly about what's coming, and she spoke about decoupling, you know, and that was interesting because she's not spoken about this in public, but she did actually say that given these very, very different political approaches towards what information the people of each country, for example, the United States and China, should have access to, just proceeding logically, she said she really didn't really see that it would end differently except through some kind of decoupling situation. And that's pretty frank words from her. So I'll end with those. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Didi, for that. I think you rightfully point out this massive knowledge gap in Europe, in the West at large, in understanding China in general, and particularly in these specialized fields, but also some of our own, you know, deficiencies in understanding our own interactions with China, and where our systems are sort of out of date in this interaction. So I have a couple of questions from the audience. and I have a couple of questions of my own. So I'm going to try to group these together to some degree. So Nigel, what I really wanted to ask you first was, you mentioned Silicon Valley as a sort of a spoiler of US-China decoupling of sorts. Some might see them as champions of coupling, but a spoiler of decoupling for sure, a potential spoiler, at least some of them, some of the big companies and investors. I guess you could add Wall Street, you could add even progressive politicians who are concerned with climate cooperation to that group. But I wonder what it looks like from the Chinese side. Are there spoilers to decoupling in China? Are there actors that are obviously more quietly pushing for Xi Jinping and China's political leadership to remain open and to remain coupled with the US in some of these critical areas? I also wanted to maybe take that one on, and then I'll bring some others to the floor for you and Didi.
Yeah, fine, thanks, Luke. Yeah, and it's certainly the case that when the trade and tech war kicked off in 2018, there was clearly a lot of concern within Chinese elite policy circles, and we saw this reflected in a kind of barrage of editorials and op-eds in the communist party-controlled press, criticizing such people as lackeys and lickspittles of America, sort of lacking moral fiber, et cetera, et cetera. And as we all know, the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda apparatus does not, direct its fire when they don't perceive that there is a problem. So clearly, there was. And I suspect to some extent still is, but Xi Jinping, I think, has got sufficient control over all the key variables not to have to worry too much about that at present. And when it comes, and I think it's certainly it was very interesting that this criticism, when one could elucidate it, wasn't about China shouldn't take on America. It was more China shouldn't take on America yet because we're not quite ready. I think that was the kind of key message that was seeking to be delivered. Very difficult in circumstances prevailing within China. So I think there was this sense that yes, China should have held its fire, waited until they were in a stronger position, and before kind of making their move in the way that they clearly have. And yes, I mean, if you think back to 2018 at Davos, it was Xi Jinping who turned up at Davos when Donald Trump didn't, and talked about China as a great exponent of globalization and international cooperation. And we're still hearing those messages coming from China's top leadership. And obviously the question is, well, how can this be when China is clearly seeking to close off in so many areas that it's still talking about international cooperation? The answer is very simple. It is cooperation with Chinese characteristics for the new era, et cetera, et cetera. It's about doing it China's way. And this is at the nub of everything China's trying to do at the moment. Is to use its economic and growing technology power to kind of reshape the global environment in ways more favorable to China and China's interests. It's promoted a new vision of the internet, new IP. It's seeking to promote Chinese technical standards with all the inherently baked-in Chinese values that these would carry. So they want cooperation, but they want cooperation on China's terms and in China's way.
Thank you. Thanks. Didi, I wanted to ask you, I know, I read in your book that where cyber theft is concerned, there's an amazing gap in the time that in Europe we become aware of that intrusion compared to when in the US and other countries that awareness of the intrusion, sort of this time between the intrusion and the detection is much longer here in the EU. So I wanted to ask you why is this the case? Is the EU in particular less equipped not only to deal with cyber theft, but some of China's other influences through technology compared to the US or China's neighbors in East Asia?
Yeah, I mean, here in Germany, I think it's, yes, it's in the book, there's approximately 7% only of these espionage, industrial espionage cases are solved. And those are the ones that we know about that get reported. So, you know, it's really super low. And I think that one answer here in Germany, again, is a very low level of threat perception. That has historical reasons. It's also rooted in the like very, very open research environment here, very generous, sort of almost developmental attitude. Here we are, you know, in the West, we're going to develop the world, we're going to help the world, this kind of thing. You know, these are some of the traditional structures of thought that we kind of labor under. And you know, which impact on how we have or haven't, you know, dealt with China in these last 40 years, in fact, on this issue. So, you know, I suppose America just has, you know, a more, well, it's a different kind of power, isn't it, from any power in Europe, really? So that's one part of the answer. The other part is that, you know, Europe is, and I'm talking here about continental Europe, I can't necessarily speak for the UK, has been sort of very dependent on the United States. It's clear since 1945. Germany again, you know, and Germany would be outside of the US, I think, is probably the key location for China's, for the CCP's technology extraction efforts. A key location, probably, you know, the second, and Europe, and certainly together, is the second after the US. So no, we don't have the awareness, we don't have the will, the political will yet here in Europe, in Germany, for example, to deal with this problem. And what I simply see is really deep running perception challenges, in that researchers, Nigel mentioned Pan Jianwei, he of course did a lot of his initial quantum computing research in Germany and in Austria, but in Germany too, and, you know, massive outflows. So there is still very little awareness of this problem. And in fact, people in Germany who are trying to raise awareness of this problem right now are having a fairly difficult time. We simply need political will at the top and more action.
Thanks. Thanks for that. I wanted to bring some more questions in to the floor. Maybe I'll take on two. I think these are for both of you. We can start with you, Nigel. You know, one question is about 5G networks and whether the US is dependent on collaboration with China to both build and operate these new mobile networks. A second question is regarding artificial intelligence and why the US and China see AI as so critical in sort of the race for global power. Why is AI as a technology so vital for a country's power? And finally, I'll bring a third one out just so we can handle some of these. China has a plan to be a technological front runner by 2035. And do you think, Nigel and Didi, do you think that it will succeed in doing so? And what might cause it to slip up from achieving this plan? So 3 questions there on 5G, AI, and the overall tech race picture.
Shall I go first, or Didi,
Sure.
what do you want?
Please.
Yeah. Okay. Well, on 5G, yeah. I mean, I think at the moment the problem the United States had was that you know, China was moving into that particular space with a kind of soup to nuts deployable system, and the US had nothing comparable, not least because the US has lost a lot of manufacturing capability, outsourced stuff that it now probably has worked out it needs to make for itself. I don't think there's any prospect now of the United States collaborating with China on 5G. I think the US is the US strategy is firstly to strangle Huawei by whatever means, and buy time to develop alternatives, and they're exploring various ones, including the so-called Open Radio Access Network, which has potential but is still in the foothills in terms of kind of deployment. My own feeling is that the UK looked at this very differently and said deploying Huawei 5G technology at the edge of the network would be a manageable risk, not risk-free, but manageable. Actually, sort of NSA technicians agreed with that, but it was geopolitics that eventually reached that decision. So I think we're going to see that the US is going to push forward on alternatives. The reality is that thus far 5G has not really lived up to expectations. It's delivered faster video streaming, but not a lot else. And part of the reason that is that there's what they call the vertical use cases haven't really developed. And I'm talking about things here like autonomous vehicles, which are critically dependent on 5G, but there is a kind of interplay as you develop these capabilities like autonomous systems, like robotic manufacturing, so the 5G networks and capabilities improve, and that's really not happening yet. So 5G is to some extent a technology that hasn't yet sort of reached its sort of anything like its potential. Why is artificial intelligence so important? Well, simply because it's very difficult to know how AI is going to progress. You have people in the industry who are pessimists and people who are kind of sublime optimists, and steering a course between those two extremes is never straightforward. But realistically, machine learning in its most advanced permutations has very considerable potential to enable machines to do things that humans can't do themselves. And in so doing, firstly to discover patterns of correlation which would not otherwise be identifiable, and which enable you to draw all sorts of conclusions that you otherwise would not. And also, artificial intelligence as a means of enhanced decision-making in complex situations. And that is a particular area where militaries are looking at artificial intelligence as something that they need to use. It's not about killer robots, although I realize that's been the kind of sort of dominant international meme when discussing these things. It's about using artificial intelligence, machine learning, to process information at a speed humans can't, and make decisions or help humans make better decisions than they would otherwise be able to do. But it really is pretty critical. Vladimir Putin said, whoever dominates artificial intelligence dominates the world, and he's actually not far wrong in terms of actually mastering these technologies. Not least because, of course, again, the artificial intelligence programs that we will see in the future will have baked into them cultural assumptions. So whose cultural assumptions inform these AI programs, are the countries that are, sort of best placed to benefit, I would argue. Finally, can China, do what it sets out to do? Well, hard to say. I very much doubt that it will be, that China will be quite where it wants to be in 2035. but I strongly suspect that it will be quite a lot of the way there, one way or another. China is en route to becoming an advanced technological society. They have considerable strengths, including a willingness to take risks in deploying and rolling out these technologies that I think particularly Europe is deficient in. You know, we're too hooked up on the precautionary principle. So I expect China to be a global power of real consequence. Whether it will be the global power is another matter. I doubt that. But even if China's approach does not carry much weight in amongst liberal democracies, it certainly attracts considerable following in what we used to call the G77.
Didi.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, Nigel's answered those, really, really well. Interestingly, I think if I may just a little bit extract from those three questions and say that I think that a really core issue that we absolutely need to focus on here is indeed, what does this kind of technological power, which is growing in China, what does it mean when it is coupled with this kind of political power? And there is perhaps the point to be made, although I don't want to defend the actions of any one particular government. You know, there have been multiple outrages around the world over history, that's for sure. However, I think there is a point to be made that whether these kinds of incredibly powerful technologies that we see growing, AI, which did, of course, come from Western nations in the first place, you know, to what extent they do, I mean, they do need to be embedded in safe political structures, which can be controlled or managed or shaped by the people for the good of the people. Now, you know, people always say, well, what about Facebook? What about Google? What about this? Well, my answer to that is, yep, and it's changing in the States. So we've seen a huge pushback against Facebook. Now, are we going to see that against the Chinese government's power as it is exercised through its technologies? Question mark. So, you know, during the Hong Kong demonstrations in 2019, it was so interesting to me that many of these very tech-savvy, intelligent, non-Communist Party Chinese people in Hong Kong, which is what Hong Kong is or was and still is, and Taiwan, so non-Communist Party China, you know, that's a very important point. China doesn't have to be a communist nation. It's not necessarily Chinese, yeah? There are alternatives, there always have been. You know, what these smart young people did that were demonstrating for their freedom, for their future, was that they tore down these lampposts that had, you know, these, you know, cameras and were doing the surveillance of the people on the streets. And they actually ripped them apart and took photos of what was in these things on the lampposts. Now, this to me is a really interesting moment. Yeah. And it says so, it encompasses so much of this sort of political challenge we have with China and its use and control of technologies, which we can't massively influence. And, you know, so I'll just go straight to question 3, which was 2035. Well, we've got this China Brain Project 2030, which is all about AI and, you know, artificial general intelligence. I think personally, this connects through to issues of immortality even. That would require some explanation, perhaps for another time. But yeah, I think they are going to achieve a huge amount, barring some event within China. Clearly, one cannot rule that out. Economic collapse, whatever, not collapse, but economic problems. Collapse, let me just scrap that word, but serious economic problems, we are seeing some. Sure, you know, 2035, why not? There's just been a pop song out on the internet, on YouTube, where this guy sings, you know, I want to take the high-speed harmony rail train to Taiwan by 2035. There we go. You know, they're going to build a train to Taiwan. Well, that's the plan. It tells us a lot. And how to avoid it? Well, only first of all, if we in Europe in particular, but absolutely also in the United States, to understand the problem properly, take it seriously, give China show it the respect that it deserves for this incredible achievement, and acknowledge how intelligently it's being handled, and actually say, no, you know what? No, we actually don't want you taking our quantum technology back. I'm sorry, but people talk about collaboration. Obviously, collaboration is hugely important, but collaboration with whom? For what? For what? Yeah, we need to be a lot more careful, and that's the only thing we can really manage. And then keep talking, and just get a lot smarter about what we're dealing with.
Thanks so much. I think that's a good way to close the event. We've reached 3 o'clock. I want to thank Nigel and Didi for these excellent presentations. For those of you who I didn't get to your questions, please grab their books for the answers, the Great Decoupling, Nigel Inkster, and China's Quest for Foreign Technology from Didi Kirsten Tatlow. Thank you so much, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.